Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohail Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast. Good morning, good evening. Good to see you. You're looking very good.
Sohail, you as well. Pleasure to catch up. It's been a long time.
Yes. Foresight is difficult enough. Now you add a word, strategic foresight. What this book about? I'm really intrigued. Let's start with that.
Yeah, great. Well, the book is called Learning from Tomorrow, using strategic foresight to prepare for the next big disruption. And it focuses on a set of tools that together are known as strategic foresight. And what it is basically is a structured, systematic way of using ideas about the future to anticipate and better prepare for change. So through strategic foresight, you're exploring different plausible futures that might arise and seeking the opportunities and preparing for the challenges that might emerge in these different possible futures.
That's everyone needs that, no? Because when you are in future looking back in the past and you say, oh, I should have done this, I should not have done this, right? So who is your audience? That's basically everyone. Are you targeting anyone specific or the entire global population?
It's a fair point that everybody needs this. The fact is that a relatively small number of people are using it. The main target are planners and decision makers, those who have to deal with risk in an organization, as well as those looking for business development, trying to identify new markets in the case of a private sector company. I should stress that the tools are not limited to, say, government and public service, although my book tends to focus more on that. It's increasingly being utilized in the private sector. And in our conversation, I'll bring out a couple of examples of that. I would say, in terms of, well, why did I write this book, which may be a natural question as well. Well, having spent much of the last quarter of a century in international organizations, together with you at the Asian Development Bank, before that at the OECD, I saw, and upon reflection, a lot of missed opportunities through short-termism. People and divisions of these organizations not always looking beyond next week or next year, and missing out and being surprised on things that would come out of the blue seemingly, but with a little bit of foresight could have been anticipated.
Well, how do you react to this? I suffered a lot every time I come up with a new idea. People want a complete roadmap. I'm trying to operate with a compass that I want to go sort of northish, and I know roads are bad. I'll prepare that way. And I think that's what sort of somehow innovation, if you take an exploratory approach, and then someone wants a clear roadmap. Now, this is a big dilemma. You want to be innovative, but you want a ways to take you there, right? And it really cannot work. How does this foresight help in that process? Because still, what is in the dark is in the dark, no?
Yeah, I would say it's important to keep in mind that strategic foresight is really a set of tools best used when you're looking beyond the next handful of years to, say, 10 or 20 years down the line. It's and I appreciate, it can be a challenge for people to get their head around it because anything dealing with the future is filled with uncertainty. And on the one hand, we can't predict it. We don't have crystal balls. Through the various structured mechanisms, tools and methodologies of foresight, though, we can come up with a fairly good, plausible set of where things are likely to unfold. There's always going to be surprises and wild cards, and those things that are so extremely unlikely but happen anyway that may not be in a scenario you develop. But drawing on different disciplines, economics, sociology, engineering, systems design, drawing upon different areas of expertise, it is possible to put together, say, 3-4 different kinds of plausible futures looking 10, 20 years down the line, not one of which is going to be, at the end of the day, absolutely perfect in predicting how things turned out. But if what we've seen in the practice of strategic foresight is if you have a handful of different scenarios that come out at the end of an exercise, it's quite likely that parts of those scenarios actually do end up revealing themselves and becoming the real future that we experience.
Yeah, so that reminds me of a course I did many years ago as part of the system planning exercise. So you are talking about a decision tree that has some stochastic element built into it, and then you get a group of people talking about the future and assign certain probability on those outcome, and then make some sort of a decision, keeping that these can happen, and when it happens, you sort of half prepared. You can't be fully prepared. Is that something like that?
Well, that's certainly, as you describe it, that those aspects are part of a typical strategic foresight exercise. Basically, it starts typically by identifying an issue. What is the issue or the problem one is looking at? An example might be and this is kind of a big picture foresight exercise, the French Agency for Development. So we've worked in the development field. The government of France has its own specialized agency that provides foreign assistance, engages in development cooperation. And several years ago, they undertook a foresight exercise. And the question was, where will development be? What will be the context of development in 15 years? So they started with, in that case, again, a very big picture question. And they worked through a number of different exercises. It was very participatory, which is one of the good things about foresight. It lends itself to involving not only the experts, say, in an organization, but drawing on expertise of other stakeholders. And how much you do that depends on the resources available, the time you have, and that sort of thing. But you can, it's often improved, the process is improved by bringing more people into it, because when you reach the outcomes, if people have been involved, they're more likely to buy into the results. So you identify this issue. A typical next step would be clarifying what are your assumptions, starting with the present day and how, say, our organization works. What are the assumptions we're operating with? And many times foresight only goes about that far and is used to address those assumptions. So it can do much more, but organizations like Global Affairs Canada, when foresight is used in that organization, oftentimes it's a team that just wants to delve into the assumptions that they have in the way that they carry out their work. And we go along day to day implicitly assuming certain things and about what's going to happen next, without having thoroughly examining them and seeing how different drivers interact. So identifying an issue, clarifying assumptions, and scanning the horizon to try to detect emerging change, emerging trends. And from there, you look at how those trends, those big drivers of change, if you will, interact. And from there, you build scenarios. And again, a typical foresight exercise might consist of 3 or 4 alternative scenarios, which have some commonalities, but oftentimes will be very different in their general orientation. One could apply pessimistic or optimistic in some ways, but usually it's a mix of different elements, looking again at how these drivers of change have generated these scenarios.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned in your book, and I was also thinking, it's a guesswork, and some people will say, and some people will say it's a insight from a group of creative people. But how do you give them sufficient credibility? You just mentioned about having a strategic team whose job is to look out far beyond tomorrow as a professional basis. So do you see organizations setting up a strategic foresight group within who is not bothered by day-to-day activities, but looking at the value creation potential or whatever that is, trying to optimize beyond tomorrow? Do you see a specific group?
Yes, I do actually. So how and where you place that group will depend on an organization's culture and structure. A typical place might be in the strategy and policy department, but it can also go in, say, the risk department. It can also be, in the case of a private sector company, in some area of responsibility for business development. But let's assume it's in kind of strategy or policy or in a decision-making part of the government. In Canada, where I'm talking to you from, the government in Ottawa has a strategic foresight unit called Policy Horizons, and it's very well respected internationally, and it's looked to as an example of how to do strategic foresight in a government. So they are set up basically in the center of government, and they coordinate across the different ministries, departments, where there are also sometimes individuals or small teams of specialists. In Asia, you have several governments that have foresight units tending to focus on technology. So that's the other thing. You can have foresight generally, and that's the case of Singapore and in Canada as governments. They have a central unit, but you can also have it dedicated to a particular theme or sector. So imagine a transport department with a foresight team. And usually, to be effective, it has to be engaging with others. It can't be there doing these studies unto itself. They've got to be reaching out to expertise elsewhere. And what they're often bringing is the rationale for doing foresight and tools, the know-how of how to carry this out. The Asian Development Bank set up a team, very small one, in its central department known as the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. And there's a couple of people with experience in foresight and related futures thinking, and they are seeding the idea and providing support to sectors, country teams, and thematic areas of the bank. And we see also the IMF and the Inter-American Development Bank also have small central teams working in this space.
So what actually happened as a part of the process, as you know, you put an IT system to transform the whole of our loans and processing whole process. How much savings will it achieve? Nobody wanted to put a number there. So somehow I'm a techie. It fell on my lap. So I went through a complete whiteboarding exercise. This is when COVID happened, and a lot of thinking through what a future state could be based on the technologies that I know and I see coming. So I come up with an obscene number. That many staff position may not be needed if we get there. And that created a huge chaos. But anyway, with a lot of chopping down, changing of assumption, that went into the board document, which led this thing to get approved. So my question is to you, how to the best way to apply those insights, and how much of those scenarios are actual? How do you make sure it has a good impact in the organization without people shrugging things off? Because once these numbers are put in there in a board document, it has to be delivered. The path has to be tracked. Right now, I'm talking to a lot of people now coming back saying, oh, okay, this is the numbers, explain. Now I'm explaining my assumption. It is a lot of work because it was just me made up those numbers based on certain assumption that I can defend. But because now it is locked in somewhere in the future, now the paths have to be traced. So what's your thoughts on that, and how can we make that better?
Sure. Well, how many years in the future did those numbers go in the example you cite?
I think it's 7 to 10 years.
Okay, that's starting to get out there. Although foresight is sometimes used in fewer than 10 years, more typically it's 10, 15, 20 years. And because once you start getting out there, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint numbers. It's just the nature of foresight that you don't tend to have specific numbers and budgets connected with it. It's more contextual. It's more the scenarios are more of a storytelling of a different setting of for example, at the grand level, you'll have the geopolitical and world and how trade relations are carried out and how people's societies have evolved. It's more of a big picture kind of setting as opposed to what you're getting at, more budgeting and forecasting using past numbers, making some assumptions and then forecasting future.
The exercise we had was the way the technologies are changing, how people might be in 7 to 10 years out, do things differently with the communication and everything else. And if we take that foresight, if you like lack of a better word, that how much of our process can be improved and what savings can we potentially make if we throw in $20 million at it. So that was the question. So it's not fully where you are, but yeah.
No, but there's definitely overlap. No, it's quite relevant to the discussion of foresight. One thing foresight would do in a case like that, in a full-blown exercise, is draw in specialists from different areas. You're looking, if I understand correctly, mostly at the how the technology changes might affect the needs of the organization, and then to put budgetary numbers on that. I guess foresight would look at interactions beyond technology, how people are living, maybe their health conditions, how they're commuting to work. I mean, a broader range of figures, and see how the different drivers of change interact. So that doesn't diminish. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, what we basically looked at today as a bank, we process loans and we follow all these processes, including communicating with the people, the beneficiaries, the borrowers. And the way the technology, how much of those can we change, how other things will interact. But anyway, this was a fun exercise, may not be there, but but the principle is the same, trying to sell the future to the present people, no?
Right. And the challenge you refer to as people, in isolation, if they haven't gone through the exercise you have, looking at the different possibilities and how technologies might evolve. If they haven't done that, the results you were coming out with might be surprising to them. And one of the challenges just in selling foresight in an organization, and why more governments or corporations haven't adopted it, is because you start talking foresight and then people may equate it with guessing, or if you start talking a bit further out into the future, it begins to sound like a sci-fi novel or movie. And maybe a little, for a leader in an organization who's very busy, who's only got half an hour for you to make the case, and you start talking about not just the technology that's coming in a few years, but the one that may come after that, and scenarios that they're just not equipped to embrace today when they're dealing with the current emergency and fire that has to be put out and responding to clients and stakeholders. It's sometimes just getting that far out in the future is too much for organizational leaders to deal with. And even if they are a bit open-minded and want to hear this and want to be challenged and challenge their teams, it takes time to do that. And if they want to do something about it, to say set up a team or fund an exercise, a foresight exercise, that takes staff, that takes time, and you start talking about a competition for budgets, and it's oftentimes what's closer at hand gets the attention, and something that's a bit further out, it's harder to deal with. I mean, if you, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm just looking back my professional life 30 years ago. Almost exactly 30 years ago. I was doing energy forecast 30 years out for the State Electricity Commission of Victoria in Melbourne. And those days, South Australia was heavily dependent on us for electricity. And our forecast was that South Australia will be importing, I mean, it's a standard a straight line forecasting scenario. We had everything, coal power, solar was not on the horizon. We talked about a little bit, tiny bit about energy efficiency. Now, if I look back today, oh my, those big power station that we built supposed to last, some of them have been shut down. Millions of people have solar power, batteries. The whole scenario is completely changed. Now, today, if you take the same approach saying, which I try to do a bit, that future coming in, maybe we won't have agreed. And again, the traditionalist will say, no, it won't happen. So that's what I think this area is very important for people to start believing, saying the fundamental assumption behind today's world is not going to hold in future. It cannot, we have seen, right?
Right.
How things
and I think coming back to that important point about the assumption, if nothing else, if one uses foresight to seriously examine and critique one's own assumptions, that's potentially opening the door to some thoughtful planning and preparation for things that we don't expect today, but with a little bit of thinking through different connections and developments we can see around us, you can see this coming. Facebook was, it came out in 2004. And, it's a novelty. It's a social media thing, the Facebook. It would have been hard at that point. If you ask, most people, many of whom were not even connected to the internet, would ask them if they would think that Facebook by 2021 would have close to 3 billion, people active on the platform. Or, being in North America in 2010, the idea that gay marriage would be accepted throughout the US and within 10 years, and indeed that dozens of countries and jurisdictions would have legalized it, from the perspective of 2010, that would have been really hard to see. More recently, in 2016, most of the political analysts and experienced pollsters and the winner himself did not predict Donald Trump would become president. But with the benefit of hindsight, these, not necessarily the specific events, not necessarily the creation of Facebook, and not necessarily greater tolerance in society for for gay marriage, but one could, if you were studying emerging trends, signals of change, and seeing the different ways that drivers can interact, you could predict populism. You could predict new technological platforms permitting people to connect, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the value of foresight, is to get people out of their box or their traditional way of thinking and what is the accepted storyline, to probe other possibilities. And I think one great thing about your program is that it's highlighting some things that are not necessarily happening right now and tomorrow, but you can clearly see, for example, electric vehicles taking off, AVs, improvement in battery storage, and people who aren't paying attention and won't necessarily see the way that you do, that 2025, 2030, 2035 will bring substantial changes to how we globally generate power and use electricity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a daunting exercise in what is assumptions, what are the assumptions and what are real. Like electricity 101, I mean, this is my field of expertise, is number one, people cannot generate their own. Number two, supply demand has to be matched. Electricity cannot be stored. And that assumption still holds into many people's head. If you take those two assumptions out, that anybody can generate electricity with a rooftop solar, anyone can store battery, then nothing holds. Electricity 101, you have shattered it through, right? So how does one identify, and who benefits from this foresight to identify which of the box you define, which walls are really wobbly because of trend that's are coming? But that's fundamentally what we are talking about, right?
Yes, and this gets at the different tools and approaches that are used. when you facilitate a foresight exercise, which can go on for weeks or months, it can be a very involved process, which often will involve very extensive research. What do we know today? And those who are at the cutting edge of research, what are they finding and what are they pointing to? There is definitely a looking back, but we're not, a foresight exercise is not just extrapolating or drawing a straight line from what has happened in the past. And it pulls expertise from different areas. And can it catch everything? No, because again, we can't predict the future. But when you see things that are in development in R&D or already are starting to appear in the case of EVs on the streets, and there are announcements daily or weekly from major companies and startups about what their plans are. Jaguar, for example, is going to get rid of their gas-powered vehicles. And by 2025, you can only get a Jaguar in EV. And this is so, you can't nail everything down. You can't possibly know about what will come next. But again, if you draw on expertise where you can get it, and this is where the resources come in, a more involved exercise that's more thorough and comprehensive, we'll be able to bring in researchers, scientists, and those who are studying these major trends. Let me just mention that one of the biggest regular foresight studies that's publicly available is produced by the National Intelligence Council of the United States. So the intelligence and security and military apparatus in the U.S. is obviously very well funded, and the National Intelligence Council, which provides briefings, highly confidential briefings to senior decision makers, also puts out every 4 years a global trends report, and it's fascinating. And it's I recommend it as a read to anybody who's even casually interested in foresight, because they come up with 3-4 scenarios of where the world's going, and the amount of time and effort and interviews that they've done, not just in the U.S. but around the world, and tapping many areas of expertise, yields a fascinating look at what could emerge in the next 10, 20 years. The next report's expected out in the next couple of months.
Now, with all these benefits, why aren't more organizations using it? How do you sell foresight, if you like?
Yeah. Well, it gets back to the point I was making earlier about busy decision makers find it difficult to think beyond a certain number of years, and they have competing demands. They have to meet the needs of today. And so maybe even they might be interested in principle, but it's just 10, 20, 30 years. They may well be retired. They have a new job. How can they justify spending time and resources on an exercise that will not produce one answer? This is the world in 2040. You're not going to get that. You're going to get these scenarios that typically are not trying to pinpoint with specific numbers exactly how things might look, but are more, as I say, painting a picture and scenario of a plausible, not the only, a plausible future. How do you sell it? Well, you cite examples like Shell Oil. So Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, back in the day, they were a leader in the private sector in using scenario development, which is a big part of foresight. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's part of foresight's approach. And their scenarios included the possibility that Gulf states producing oil would someday realize their power and restrict supply and drive up prices. And with this as one of the scenarios that they had drawn out in the 1970s, they were in fact better prepared for the outcome than many other big oil producers.
Yeah, I think there is a bit more than that, though. As you know, I mean, this is my view, like your opinion. Technology or anything, there are early adopters, people who copycat, and there are laggards. Now, if your organization leaders are laggards, many of them, because of many reasons, they don't want to move with technology, don't like ideas. Unless you get rid of those people, you cannot move on. Like, I mean, right now, the same people coming and telling me I bought an electric car post-retirement, the same person who was sitting in his with the power stopped me from doing an electric vehicle project that I tried to do 2011, coming back saying this technology doesn't work. Just don't waste your energy on this, giving you advice as a big brother. And these people stop because they are not, it's nothing wrong with any organization, but every organization have them. So I'm just thinking to implement the insight, you need to somehow remove these people. Like if you want to decarbonize economy, you may have to decarbonize some of the people because some people will not. I mean, how do you react to that? So bringing in more young people, or how do you make organization more receptible to these ideas of aligning ourselves for the future as opposed to continuing with the momentum of the past? No.
Yeah. And the organizations, wherever they are situated, that are not taking a more future-oriented perspective, and in other words, future-proofing their policies by looking ahead and factoring in the learnings from a foresight exercise into their current planning, and being similarly open to new ideas and possibilities, they will suffer from a competitive standpoint. They will have problems recruiting and retaining staff. I mean, this is going to be a greater challenge in the private sector. If you look back to, say, Kodak, which was a leader in photography, and they figured out that digital cameras might be a thing. They spent a little time on it, but they did not do enough, and they did not put the priority on it in a timely way, and they went bust. But I mean, your particular situation, how do you I guess create a setting that is conducive to thinking outside the box and into the future? Younger staff can help. They're more that's a generalization. It's not just anybody who happens to be say under 30, but appropriately trained and with other skills. But really coming in with an open mindset is a key thing, and that's another reason why foresight sometimes has difficulty sticking, because even if the exercise is carried out, what may come out of that exercise in terms of scenarios may not be very pleasing to decision makers, because it may well imply we've got to fundamentally shift how we do business if two of these three scenarios turns out to be true. And it's like shocking with the truth. And organizations have to be agile enough, open-minded enough, allow for innovation. And if they don't, they may plod along. And international organizations are hard to shut down, right? The history shows that it doesn't happen very often. So there's a lot of leeway for being a bit slower to take up and be open to new ideas, right? In the private sector, as we saw in the case of COVID, how many companies went bust or are struggling to survive. And there are actually a lot of examples, including among small companies, that quickly turned. They adjusted. They found a way to stay in business, whether it was a restaurant that took extra steps to offer curbside service or delivery, or the distillery in the United States that found that the alcohol that they had could be used to make sanitizer. I mean, that kind of quick thinking and readiness for change, that is an environment in which something like foresight tends to be more successful. I don't think I've answered your question very well, I'm afraid, except to express sympathy for sometimes, restricted thinking and not wanting to rock the boat, which is just one other thing I would say why foresight isn't taken up more often is it rocks the boat. And in a public sector organization, whether it's a local government, national government, intergovernmental organization, the long-serving civil servants in these bodies, they don't necessarily score points by challenging fundamental perceived truths, and I use that in quotation marks. This comes to the assumptions. Challenging assumptions is not always a career strengthening move in a conservative, risk-averse organization.
Yeah. I mean, so what we agree basically that yes, organizations nimble to be survived, to survive in the future, and of course, international organization, government-owned large organization don't really die. But even if the leadership wants to turn things around, using Kodak as an example, it must have been a comfortable death. I mean, of course, we use the term now Kodak moment in a very different sense. But those managers who were Kodak was not stressed. They had a comfortable pension. They died. The shareholder lost tremendous value because shareholders who paid for it. So yeah, it's a very difficult environment. So my question is to you, what are the ideal conditions for applying foresight then? I mean, what are the conditions that if you're a CEO, you decided, yes, I'm convinced, I read the book, this is the way to go. How do you create those enabling environment?
You give it's, foresight is often intertwined
Mm-hmm.
with not effective knowledge management
Mm-hmm.
and with innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And so an organization that's good at knowledge management is likely to be one that's also good at foresight. And actually, the learnings from a foresight process feed into
Mm-hmm.
the knowledge of the organization, and can be quite useful. So also in terms of innovation, it's fine to talk about, we need to be an innovative organization. Well, innovation does not always yield success, at least not in the first try or second or fourth. You think you've got the story of this successful IT entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley wearing as a badge of pride the number of times that previous efforts failed, because you have to try some things out to find things that work, and through fail you can often find your next success. So in short, organizations that are more open-minded, that are willing to see assumptions challenged, and where employees feel empowered to speak their mind and to try new things, these are organizations where foresight's more likely to succeed. Interestingly, I find it interesting. There was a study last year, and it was kind of a back of the envelope, rough approximation, so I wouldn't put too much on it. It was looking at how many of the Fortune 500 companies have in-house capacity on strategic foresight, which you would think would be a no-brainer. I cited the example of Shell, and there are many other examples like that where companies look seriously at what are possible, plausible futures. But only about 1 in 4 of the Fortune 500 have this in-house capacity. But what I'm finding in the course of the pandemic is that more and more companies are expressing an interest. You see much more written on the subject. I'm participating in communities of practice, and even in the government. To take the U.S. government as an example, there's a community of interest, they call it, of foresight professionals working in different departments in the U.S. government.